The morning the last well on our road ran dry, it was a Tuesday in the summer of 2019, and the sky was that flat, bleached white it gets when the heat has decided to stay. I remember standing at my fence line a little after 6, the ground already warm through the soles of my boots, and watching my neighbor Delbert coast his truck down the gravel with the window down. That truck was too clean for a farm truck. It always was. He slowed at my gate the way a man does when he's got something he's been saving up to say, and he looked past me at the 3 acres my late wife Ruth had worked, at the tangle of it, the raised beds and the little pond and the odd shaggy look of the place. And he said, plain and not unkind, "You still fooling with that garden, Harold? Para, county says we're in a drought now. Officially. You can't feed a place off a patch that size." I told him I was farming. He nodded like a man agreeing with a child, and he drove on, and the dust hung behind him a long while because there was no moisture in the air to bring it down. I want to be honest about my reasons for keeping that ground the way it was, because it would be easy to make myself sound wiser than I was that morning. The truth is, I kept it that way because Ruth had built it, and she'd been gone 2 years by then, and I hadn't the heart to change a single row. I was 68 that summer. She'd have been 66. We'd been on this 160 acres since 1976, and for most of those years the money came off the big fields, the corn, and the beans, the way it does for everybody out here. The 3 acres by the house was hers. She called it her garden, and she let the neighbors call it that too, and she never once corrected a man who underestimated it, which I've come to understand was a kind of patience I didn't have. Delbert had 400 acres of corn that year, and a center pivot that cost more than my first house, and by the middle of July, that corn was curling in on itself like paper held to a match. The county extension man, a good young fellow named Corey with a clipboard and a clean tan Carhartt jacket he wore even in the heat, came by all our places that month, with his numbers. He stood in my drive and read me the rainfall figure off his clipboard. 4 1/10 inches since the 1st of May, against a normal of near 11. And he told me the reservoir was at 31%, and the aquifer had dropped 11 feet since spring. And he said it kindly but firmly, the way you'd tell a man a road was washed out ahead. Everybody's going to be buying feed and buying produce from 3 counties over by August, he said. There's just no water in the ground for it. He was a decent man, and he meant well, and he was, as it turned out, wrong about my 3 acres, though he'd have had no way to know why, because the reason was written in a notebook in a chest in my barn, and I hadn't yet had the nerve to read it. That's the part I have to own. I knew the notebook was there. Ruth had kept a garden ledger. The whole 43 years we were together, a marbled composition book gone soft at the corners, the cover worn to gray, her hands small and careful in pencil that had turned brown with the years. After she passed, I'd put it in the cedar chest in the barn with her gloves and her seed tins, and I told myself I'd read it when I was ready. And every season I decided I wasn't ready, because to read it was to hear her, and I wasn't strong enough for that. So there it sat, while Corey read me his figures, and while Delbert coasted past, shaking his head, and while the whole road started to go brown and brittle around a green patch that made no sense to anybody but the woman who'd built it and was no longer here to explain it. I'd like to tell you I marched out and got that notebook the day Corey gave me his numbers, but I didn't. I put it off another 11 days. What finally sent me to the barn was the pond. Ruth's 3 acres sloped gentle toward the house, and at the low corner, she dug out a little pond years back, maybe 40 feet across, and ringed it with cattail and willow and a mess of plants I never learned the names of. Everybody else's stock ponds that summer were rings of cracked mud with a dark eye of water shrinking in the middle. I've been watching them dry up all down the road. But Ruth's pond, that little 40-foot pond on the highest of the 3 properties on our stretch, hadn't dropped but a hand's width. I stood over it that 11th evening after Corey came, and I couldn't make it add up because water runs downhill, and her pond was uphill of every dry hole on the road, and it had no business holding when theirs were gone. And I heard her voice in my head, not sad, just matter of fact, the way she got when I'd missed something obvious, saying, "It's all in the book, Harold, if you'd ever bother." So I went to the barn in the last of the light, and I lifted the lid of that cedar chest, and I sat down on an upturned bucket, and I read my wife's garden ledger by the light of the single bulb over the workbench, and I stayed out there until near midnight, and I understood by the end of it that I had spent 2 years mourning a woman without once understanding what she'd actually done on that ground. The early pages were what you'd expect, planting dates and frost dates, what did well and what didn't, the small failures and small victories of a garden. But it changed around 1991. That's the year I remembered that she'd started reading everything she could get her hands on, driving the 40 minutes to the library in town and coming home with books stacked on the seat. I'd thought it was a hobby. The notebook told me otherwise. Somewhere in there she'd stopped keeping a garden and started building a system, and she'd written it all down in that plain, careful hand, and I had walked past it every day for 28 years and called it her garden. She'd terraced the slope, I read, not for looks, but to slow the water, so that every drop that fell on those 3 acres had to walk down the hill instead of run, had to soak in at each level before it spilled to the next. She'd sunk what she called sponges all through the beds. Trenches she'd dug and packed with wood and straw and old manure, buried logs gone punky and soft, that held water like a wrung-out rag holds it. Slow, for weeks. Water? She'd planted in guilds, she called them. Tall things shading short things, deep roots pulling up what shallow roots couldn't reach. So the ground was never bare to the sun and never lost its moisture to the wind. And the pond, the little 40-foot pond, wasn't a stock pond at all. It was the bottom of a machine. Everything on those 3 acres drained toward it slow, filtered through all that living ground, and it fed back up through the roots and the shade and the cool damp air, the way a spring feeds a meadow. She'd built herself a piece of ground that made its own weather, and she'd done it a spadeful at a time over near 28 years while the men on the road called it her garden, and she let them. But it was one line that stopped me, underlined twice, near the back, dated only a few months before she got sick. It said, "When it stops raining for everybody else, this is where the county comes." That was all. No explanation, no plan below it, just that one line underlined twice in her brown pencil and a question mark she'd added in different, lighter lead, as if she'd written the thought and then wondered at herself for the size of it. I sat there a long time with that, because she hadn't built a garden to feed the 2 of us. Nobody terraces 3 acres and buries logs for 28 years to keep 2 old people in tomatoes. She'd built it for a dry year she knew was coming, the way she knew everything, quiet and years ahead, and she'd built it big enough to matter to more than us, and then she died before the dry year came and left the whole thing to a man who called it her garden and hadn't the sense to read the book. I closed it and I sat in the barn, and I'll tell you I wept some, not only for missing her, though there was plenty of that, but because I understood for the first time that I'd been left a job and I hadn't even known I was holding it. The next morning I was out before 5, before the heat, walking those 3 acres the way you walk, a place you've never really seen, and now that I knew what I was looking at, I couldn't stop seeing it. The terraces I thought were just the lay of the land were level as a tabletop, each one. And where I dug down with a spade, the soil came up dark and cool and crumbling and smelling like a creek bank, 6-8 inches of it, black as coffee grounds, when the field soil out on my corn ground was pale and dry and blew off in the wind. I dug down into one of her sponge trenches, and a foot down the wood was still damp. Damp in the worst drought in 40 years. Damp when the reservoir was at 31%. And I sat back on my heels and I laughed out loud because it was so simple and so patient and so completely beyond anything Corey's clipboard could measure. That whole 3 acres was holding water like a held breath. I did some figuring that week, on paper, because I'm not a man who trusts a feeling until the numbers agree with it. I measured the beds and counted what was growing, and it staggered me. She'd been running that ground so thick and so layered that I couldn't hardly find bare dirt. Beans climbing the corn, squash sprawled under both, greens tucked in the shade of the tomatoes, root crops down low, fruit trees she'd planted years back, finally big enough to matter. 140 of them by my count when I walked and tallied. Apple and pear and plum and peach and berry canes I'd thought were a weedy fence. And every bit of it green and setting fruit, while the county browned around it because it had water when nothing else did. Water she'd been storing in the ground itself for near 28 years, one rain at a time, against exactly this summer. I want to tell you about Corey coming back, because that's when I knew for certain I wasn't imagining it. He came in the last week of July on his rounds, and I flagged him down and I asked him to walk the 3 acres with me. He stepped over the first terrace and stopped. He didn't say anything for a while. He knelt down and he pushed his fingers into the soil the way a man does when he can't believe what he's touching, and he dug down a little with his hand, and he was quiet, and then he took a soil probe off his belt and drove it in and pulled a core and looked at it. He was quiet a good while longer. Corey was a young man with a lot of numbers, but he wasn't a fool, and he knew when the numbers he'd been carrying didn't fit the ground in front of him. He finally stood up and he looked out over the whole 3 acres, all that impossible green, and he said one word. He said, "How?" Not even a question, just the word. Flat. The way you say it when the thing in front of you shouldn't be. So I told him about the terraces and the sponges and the pond and the shade, and he listened without writing anything down, which for Corey was a considerable thing. And at the end of it he said, "I've got farms with $200,000 irrigation systems that can't hold moisture like this," and she did it with a shovel. And then he said quieter, "You know what this ground could do right now, don't you?" And I said I was starting to, and he said it could feed people. Which was, near word for word, what Ruth had written in the back of her book. Now here is where I have to tell you the hard part, which is that having the water and having the sense to use it right are 2 different things, and I had one and not the other. I could keep 3 acres alive in a drought because a dead woman had spent 30 years making it so. But I was one man of 68, and there was more food coming off that ground than I could pick, let alone use, and out past my fence the county was drying up, and a little grocery in town had started rationing what produce it could get, and charging what it had to, and folks on fixed incomes were doing without. I knew that from the diner, where by then the talk had turned from the drought in general to my 3 acres in particular. I'll be honest, the version of the story that made it to the diner had grown some in the telling. By the 2nd week I heard that I had a secret. Well, the government didn't know about, and by the 3rd week I heard I'd struck an underground spring, and one fellow had it that I'd been trucking water in at night, which would have been a neat trick on my income. The truth was harder to gossip about, because the truth was just a woman and a shovel and 30 years. And that doesn't fit in a diner story as neat as a secret well does. But the talk did one useful thing. It brought people out to look. And the first one out to look on a hot still morning in early August was Delbert. He came down the road in that clean truck, though it wasn't so clean anymore, dust having settled on everything that summer, and he pulled up at my gate the same as always, but this time he got out. He walked over to the fence, and he looked at the 3 acres a long time, at the green of it, against the brown of his own dying corn, just visible over the rise, and he didn't say anything smart. Delbert had lost most of his crop by then. I knew that. The whole road knew that, and a man doesn't come look at a thing that shames his own year, unless something in him needs to understand it. He finally said, "Ruth do all this?" And I said she did, over 28 years, and he was quiet. And then he said, "I called it a garden." And I said, "So did I." And that was as close to an apology as 2 old men out here get, and it was enough. Then he said the thing that turned it, though. He said it plain, looking at the ground and not at me, he said, "There's a lot of folks in town could use what's coming off this. More than you can pick alone." And I said I've been thinking the same and losing sleep over it, and he said, "Well, I got no corn to tend, and that's how it started." What happened over the next 6 weeks I still can hardly account for, except to say it was the ground doing the last of what Ruth built it to do, and the people doing what people out here still do when you give them half a reason. Delbert came the next morning with 2 of his grown boys, and they picked alongside me, and word went around, and by the end of that first week there were a dozen folks out there in the cool of the morning. And by the end of the month it was more than I could count some days. We picked at first light before the heat, and we set up tables under the willows by Ruth's pond and the little grocer in town, a man named Pot, whose shelves had gone half bare. He came out and looked, and he cried, "I'm not ashamed to say it for him," and then he loaded his truck. We didn't sell it to him. I want to be clear on that because it matters to how I understand what my wife built. We didn't sell a thing off that ground that summer. Ruth's line hadn't said, "This is where the county buys." It said, "This is where the county comes." So it went out free to whoever needed it. Through the grocer's cooler because he had the cold and I didn't, and through the church that had a van, and through the school kitchen that fed the kids whose folks were short. I did some figuring at the end of it because I needed to know the size of the thing, and I sat down in October with the notebook and my own scratch tally, and I worked it out. Off those 3 acres, in the driest summer in 40 years, we picked and gave away better than 19,000 pounds of food between the 1st of August and the first hard frost. Vegetables and fruit and greens, near 10 tons of it, from 3 acres, in a drought when Delbert's 400 acres of corn had made almost nothing, and the reservoir bottomed out at 19% in September before the fall rains finally broke it. Corey ran his own numbers on it later and told me it fed, at the rate the county figures such things, somewhere over 400 families for the stretch of the worst of it. 400 families. Off Ruth's garden, the one the whole road, had spent 30 years not taking seriously. He came out with the county's paper one last time that fall to write it up official, and he stood by the pond in the cool, and he said, "There's not a system I could design or a grant I could write that would have done what this did." She was 30 years ahead of every one of us, and I told him that was about the truest thing anyone had said all summer. I've had 2 more summers to sit with all of it now, and I've kept the ground the way she built it, and I read the notebook of an evening the way some men read scripture, a page at a time, in her hand, in the brown pencil, and I don't dread it anymore. I've come to understand a few things I didn't understand. That white-skied Tuesday when Delbert told me you can't feed a place off a patch that size. He was right about the size and wrong about everything that matters, because the size of a thing and the worth of a thing were never the same, and my wife knew that near 30 years before I did. She used to say, and I found it written in the book too, so I know I'm remembering it right, that the ground will give you back exactly the patience you put into it, no more and no less, and that most folks quit on it years before it was ready to answer. Everybody on our road was watering the top of dry dirt that summer, throwing money and water at ground that couldn't hold either, and she'd spent 28 years teaching 3 acres how to hold, so that when the sky quit on all of us, her ground didn't. The clever way was a $200,000 pivot that failed in a drought. The patient way was a shovel and near 3 decades, and a woman who thought further ahead than any of us knew. I think about that underlined line, most of all, the one with the question mark she'd added later, "When it stops raining for everybody else. This is where the county comes," and I understand now that the question mark wasn't doubt about whether it would work. She knew it would work. The question mark was her wondering whether whoever came after her would have the sense to see what she'd made and the heart to give it away instead of sell it. I like to think I answered her question the right way. In the end, even if it took me 2 years and a dead well and 11 days of putting off a notebook to do it. If you've got a piece of ground somebody's laughing at, or a patient thing in your own life that folks keep telling you is too small to matter, I'd like to hear about it in the comments, because I've learned this year that the small patient things are usually the ones holding the water when everything else runs dry. Sit with it. Read the book somebody left you, even if you're afraid to hear their voice in it. And if any of this meant something to you, subscribe and stay a while, because we move slow on this channel, but we always get where we're going, the same as the water going down the hill Ruth built, one patient level at a time.